The small, quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name. It was a community where children played freely in the streets, neighbors exchanged warm greetings over white picket fences, and life moved at a peaceful pace. But one chilly morning, that tranquility was shattered. The sound of helicopters buzzing overhead broke through the stillness, followed by the screeching of tires as armored vehicles roared onto Maple Street. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, confused and alarmed. What could possibly be happening in this sleepy town? At the center of the chaos stood Mr. Elijah Johnson, an 82-year-old retired schoolteacher who had lived in his modest home for over 40 years. He was a man of routine, early morning walks, reading books on his porch and tending to his small garden of roses. His house, though humble, was filled with memories, photographs of students he had taught, awards recognizing his dedication to education, and faded letters from people whose lives he had touched. On this particular morning, Elijah was startled awake by the commotion outside. Still in his threadbare robe, he shuffled to his front door, squinting against the harsh glare of floodlights. What he saw outside left him stunned. A swarm of heavily armed SWAT officers surrounded his property, shouting commands through megaphones. "Come out with your hands up," they barked, their voices cutting through the crisp air like knives. Accusations flew. Elijah was being accused of harboring a dangerous fugitive wanted for violent crimes. His mind raced. A fugitive? In his home? It made no sense. He had spent his entire life serving others, teaching history to underprivileged children, and advocating for peace and justice. How could he possibly be involved in something so sinister? Elijah's confusion quickly turned to fear as the officers stormed toward him. Without warning, they grabbed him roughly, forcing him to the ground. His frail body hit the cold pavement with a thud, and his hands were cuffed behind his back. Despite his protests, he was searched aggressively, his dignity stripped away in front of his neighbors. People watched helplessly from their windows, whispering among themselves. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. This wasn't just any man. It was Mr. Johnson, the beloved teacher who had shaped generations of young minds. Why was he being treated like a criminal? As Elijah lay on the driveway, his thoughts drifted back to another time, another struggle. Born into the Jim Crow South, he had grown up facing discrimination and hardship. He remembered the segregated water fountains, the whites-only signs, and the constant reminders that he was considered less than human because of the color of his skin. Yet even then, he had refused to let hatred define him. Instead, he channeled his pain into purpose, becoming a teacher to inspire hope in others. Now, decades later, here he was again, kneeling on the ground, humiliated and powerless. The officers continued to bark orders, accusing him of withholding information or lying about the fugitive's whereabouts. Each accusation stung more than the last. Elijah tried to explain, his voice trembling but steady. "I don't know anything about this," he pleaded. "You've got the wrong person." But his words fell on deaf ears. To them, he was just another suspect, another faceless individual caught in the crosshairs of suspicion. Despite the humiliation, Elijah noticed something strange. As he looked around, he saw familiar faces peering out from behind curtains. Mrs. Thompson from across the street, Mr. Patel 2 doors down, young Tommy who often helped him carry groceries. These were people who knew him, who trusted him, who respected him. Their wide eyes reflected shock and disbelief. In that moment, Elijah realized that while the officers might not see him for who he truly was, his community did, and that gave him strength. The raid dragged on as the SWAT team tore through his home, searching for evidence that didn't exist. Drawers were emptied, furniture overturned, and walls inspected inch by inch. Every item they handled told a story. Photographs of Elijah standing beside civil rights leaders, certificates honoring his years of service, handwritten notes from former students thanking him for changing their lives. But none of it mattered. To the officers, all they saw was a suspect, someone guilty until proven innocent. For Elijah, the worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or the accusations. It was the way he was being treated, as if he were invisible, as if his life and contributions meant nothing. He thought about all the times he had stood in front of classrooms teaching children about resilience and justice. He had always believed in the power of education to break down barriers and bring people together. Yet here he was, living proof that some battles never truly ended. As the minutes ticked by, tensions mounted. The officers grew increasingly frustrated, their shouts growing louder and more aggressive. One of them shoved Elijah slightly, demanding answers. "Why aren't you cooperating? Do you think you're above the law?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. For a brief moment, Elijah felt a flicker of anger. How dare they treat him this way? How dare they dismiss him as if he were nothing? But then something shifted inside him. Anger gave way to resolve. Humiliation gave way to pride. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything he represented. It was about the countless marches he had participated in, the brutal attacks he had survived, and the lifelong fight for equality and respect. If there was ever a time to stand tall, it was now. Elijah's mind was a whirlwind of emotions as he lay on the cold, hard driveway, his hands cuffed behind his back. The sharp sting of the asphalt against his knees felt insignificant compared to the weight of the memories flooding his thoughts. He had lived through some of the darkest times in American history, and yet here he was facing a new kind of injustice, one that felt eerily familiar. As the officers continued their aggressive search of his home, Elijah couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Born in 1930s Mississippi, Elijah grew up in a world where segregation wasn't just a law, it was a way of life. His earliest memories were of watching his parents navigate the treacherous waters of racism and inequality. They worked tirelessly, his father as a sharecropper and his mother as a seamstress, to provide for their family while enduring constant indignities. Elijah remembered walking miles to attend a one-room schoolhouse meant for black children, while white students rode buses to modern buildings with proper resources. He remembered sitting on the back seat of buses, drinking from water fountains marked colored and being forced to enter restaurants through back doors. These injustices weren't distant stories to him. They were scars etched deeply into his soul. But Elijah wasn't one to let bitterness consume him. From a young age, he realized that hatred only bred more hatred. Instead, he chose to channel his pain into something positive: education. When he was old enough, he began attending rallies and meetings led by civil rights activists. It was there that he first heard Martin Luther King Jr. speak, a moment that changed the course of his life forever. Dr. King's words resonated with Elijah in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The idea that love could conquer hate, that nonviolence could dismantle systems of oppression, it gave him hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. Elijah threw himself into the movement with unwavering determination. He participated in marches, sit-ins, and protests, often risking his safety to fight for justice. He recalled one particularly harrowing night when he and a group of fellow activists were ambushed during a peaceful demonstration. Rocks and bottles rained down on them, and the sound of angry shouts echoed in the darkness. Elijah had been struck on the head with a baton, leaving a scar that would remain visible for the rest of his life. But even in the face of violence, he refused to retaliate. That night, as blood trickled down his forehead, he made a silent vow to never stop fighting, not for himself but for future generations. After years of activism, Elijah found his true calling in teaching. He believed that education was the key to breaking cycles of ignorance and prejudice. So he became a history teacher, dedicating his career to ensuring that young people understood the struggles of those who came before them. His classroom wasn't just a place to learn facts and dates. It was a sanctuary where students could ask questions, challenge assumptions, and dream of a better world. Many of his former students went on to become leaders in their own right, crediting Elijah for instilling in them the courage to stand up for what was right. Now, decades later, as he knelt on his driveway surrounded by armed officers, Elijah couldn't help but draw parallels between his past and present. The fear in his chest reminded him of the terror he felt during those early protests. The dismissive tone of the officers reminded him of the countless times he had been told he didn't matter, simply because of the color of his skin. And yet, despite everything, he still carried within him the same resilience that had sustained him all those years ago. What kept him going now wasn't anger or defiance. It was purpose. Elijah knew that moments like this weren't about him alone. They were about the legacy he represented. He thought about the photographs inside his house, the ones showing him standing shoulder to shoulder with giants of the civil rights movement. Those images weren't just memorabilia. They were reminders of the battles fought and won. Battles that had paved the way for progress, however imperfect it might be. As the officers rummaged through his belongings, Elijah noticed how callous they seemed. They tossed aside items without a second glance, items that held immense meaning to him. A stack of letters from former students expressing gratitude, a framed certificate recognizing his contributions to desegregation efforts in public schools, even a faded newspaper clipping featuring an article about his role in organizing voter registration drives. To the officers, these things were irrelevant. But to Elijah, they were pieces of his identity, fragments of a life spent striving for justice. Despite the humiliation, Elijah found solace in knowing that his community was watching. Neighbors stood quietly behind their curtains, witnessing the ordeal unfold. Some looked horrified, others angry, but all were undoubtedly affected. Elijah had always believed in the power of community, that people could come together to support one another in times of need. He hoped that this incident would serve as a wake-up call, not just for his neighbors, but for society at large. Maybe, just maybe, it would spark conversations about fairness, respect, and accountability. As the raid dragged on, Elijah's resolve hardened. He realized that this moment wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about reclaiming his dignity. It was about reminding everyone present, including the officers, that he was more than the accusations hurled at him. He was a man who had dedicated his life to making the world a better place. A man who had endured unimaginable hardships but had never given up. A man whose story deserved to be heard. In that instant, Elijah decided that he wouldn't let this experience break him. If anything, it would strengthen his resolve to continue fighting, not with fists or weapons, but with words and actions. Words that could pierce through ignorance and actions that could inspire change. Little did the SWAT team know they were dealing with someone far greater than the sum of their assumptions, someone who had faced far worse and emerged victorious. Someone who, despite the odds, still believed in the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. The tension in the air was palpable as the SWAT team continued their frenzied search of Elijah's home. Every drawer was yanked open, every shelf emptied, every corner inspected with military precision. Yet, despite their efforts, they found nothing. No weapons, no fugitive, no evidence to support the accusations that had brought them there. The absence of proof only seemed to fuel their frustration. One officer, visibly agitated, turned his attention back to Elijah, who remained cuffed and kneeling on the driveway. "You're hiding something," the officer growled, stepping closer. His voice carried a mix of anger and desperation, as though he couldn't accept that they might have made a mistake. He glared down at Elijah, his eyes narrowing behind the visor of his helmet. "Why aren't you talking? Why are you acting like you're better than us?" Elijah looked up slowly, meeting the officer's gaze with an intensity that caught everyone off guard. There was no fear in his expression, no trace of the humiliation he had endured moments earlier. Instead, there was a quiet confidence, a strength that seemed to emanate from deep within him. It was as if he had tapped into a wellspring of resilience built over decades of hardship and triumph. For a brief moment, the officer hesitated, taken aback by the calm defiance in Elijah's eyes. Then Elijah spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but with a clarity that silenced the chaos around him. His voice carried a weight that demanded attention, cutting through the noise like a blade slicing through fog. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his tone measured yet firm. The question hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. At first, no one responded. The officers froze mid-motion, unsure how to react. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others shifted uncomfortably in their gear. Even the commanding officer, who had been barking orders just moments before, paused to consider what Elijah had said. It wasn't so much the words themselves, but the way they were delivered, with authority, with purpose, with an undeniable sense of self-worth. For Elijah, those 5 simple words weren't just a rhetorical question. They were a challenge. Challenge to see beyond the surface, to recognize the humanity and history standing right in front of them. He knew that many people underestimated him because of his age, his race, or the modest appearance of his home. But beneath the surface lay a lifetime of achievements, sacrifices, and contributions to society that few could match. And now, in this moment of vulnerability, he refused to let anyone diminish his worth. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant hum of the helicopters still circling above. Neighbors who had been watching anxiously from their windows leaned forward, curious about what would happen next. Would the officers dismiss Elijah's question as irrelevant? Or would they take a step back and truly consider the implications of what he was saying? One of the younger officers, a man in his late 20s, finally broke the silence. "Who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his tone laced with skepticism. But there was also a flicker of curiosity in his voice, as if part of him genuinely wanted to understand. Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then, with a grace that commanded respect, he began to speak. "I am someone who has spent my entire life fighting for justice," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during some of the darkest days of our nation's history. I survived beatings, arrests, and threats simply because I believed in equality. I taught generations of children, not just facts and figures, but values like compassion, integrity, and courage." As he spoke, Elijah's words painted vivid pictures in the minds of those listening. He described the terror of facing angry mobs during protests, the exhaustion of working long hours to register voters in hostile environments, and the joy of seeing students succeed against all odds. Each story was a testament to his unwavering commitment to making the world a better place. And each story forced the officers to confront the reality that they were dealing with someone far greater than they had anticipated. To emphasize his point, Elijah nodded toward the house where a faded photograph hung on the living room wall. In it, a younger Elijah stood beside Dr. King, both men smiling warmly despite the challenges they faced. "That's me," he said simply. "And that's who I've always been, a fighter for what's right." The impact of his words was immediate. Several officers exchanged awkward glances, clearly unsettled by the revelation. Some looked away, unable to meet Elijah's gaze, while others removed their helmets as if suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation. Even the commanding officer, who had appeared so certain just moments earlier, now seemed uncertain. He glanced at the photo visible through the window, then back at Elijah, as if trying to reconcile the frail, elderly man before him with the courageous activist in the picture. It wasn't just the content of Elijah's stories that struck a chord. It was the way he carried himself. Despite the cuffs binding his wrists and the indignity of being treated like a criminal, he exuded dignity and poise. He wasn't begging for mercy or pleading for leniency. He was asserting his identity, reminding everyone present of the legacy he represented. And in doing so, he forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, prejudice, and the assumptions they had made. The standoff reached a tipping point when one of the officers muttered under his breath, "We messed up." It was barely audible, but the sentiment rippled through the group. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted. The aggression that had defined their arrival began to dissipate, replaced by a somber realization of their mistake. The lead investigator, who had initially dismissed Elijah as just another suspect, approached him cautiously. "Sir," he said, his tone markedly softer than before, "we may have acted on faulty information. We'll need to verify a few details, but—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Instead, he signaled to another officer to remove Elijah's handcuffs. As the metal restraints fell away, Elijah rubbed his wrists gently, wincing slightly but maintaining his composure. Though the raid was far from over, the dynamic had changed irrevocably. What had started as a confrontation rooted in suspicion and hostility had transformed into something else entirely. Elijah's quiet strength had disarmed the SWAT team, not with weapons or threats, but with truth and authenticity. Those 5 words, "Do you know who I am?" had pierced through the barriers of ignorance and prejudice, forcing the officers to see him not as a suspect, but as a human being with a rich and meaningful history. As the scene unfolded, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the sudden quiet. They gathered cautiously, their expressions a mixture of relief and disbelief. Many approached Elijah, offering hugs and words of support. Some even directed pointed questions at the officers, demanding answers for the unnecessary intrusion. Though tensions remained high, there was a growing sense that justice, and perhaps redemption, was within reach. For Elijah, this moment wasn't just about vindication. It was about planting seeds of understanding and empathy. He knew that real change wouldn't come overnight, but he also knew that every interaction mattered. Every word spoken, every gesture made, had the potential to bridge divides and foster connection. And as he stood there, surrounded by his community and the very officers who had wronged him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was another chapter in the ongoing fight for justice. The raid ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a trail of overturned furniture, scattered papers, and shattered trust. The SWAT team packed up their gear in silence, the weight of their mistake hanging heavily over them. Neighbors lingered outside, whispering among themselves, their faces a mix of anger, confusion, and relief. Elijah stood on his driveway, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had left faint red marks. Though physically unharmed, he felt the emotional toll of the ordeal settling into his bones. Yet, despite everything, he remained composed, his dignity intact, his spirit unbroken. As the armored vehicles rumbled away and the helicopters faded into the distance, Elijah turned to face his neighbors. They crowded around him, offering words of comfort and reassurance. Mrs. Thompson brought him a blanket, draping it gently over his shoulders. Young Tommy, who often helped Elijah with his groceries, handed him a glass of water, his hands trembling slightly. Others expressed their outrage at what had happened, promising to speak out against such injustices. But Elijah didn't want vengeance or retribution. Instead, he raised his hand, signaling for quiet. "Thank you all for your support," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that calmed the restless crowd. "But we must remember that this isn't about blame, it's about understanding. Today was a mistake, yes, but it's also an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to come together." His words resonated deeply, not just with his neighbors, but with the few officers who still lingered awkwardly near the scene. One of them, a young man named Officer Ramirez, stepped forward hesitantly. His face was flushed with shame, and he avoided making direct eye contact with Elijah. "Sir," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, I'm sorry for how we treated you. We were wrong." Elijah studied the officer for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then, to everyone's surprise, he nodded slowly. "Apologies are important," he said, "but actions matter more. If you truly mean what you say, then let's use this moment to start a dialogue, not just between us but within our community." The idea took root quickly. Over the next few days, news of the incident spread far beyond Oak Ridge. Local media outlets picked up the story, highlighting Elijah's grace under pressure and shining a light on systemic issues within law enforcement. The police department issued a formal apology, vowing to review their procedures and improve accountability. But Elijah wasn't satisfied with mere promises. He wanted action, real, meaningful change that would prevent others from experiencing what he had endured. To that end, he invited the officers back to his home, not for retribution, but for conversation. At first, many were hesitant. Some feared retaliation or public backlash, while others worried about facing Elijah again after treating him so poorly. But Elijah insisted, emphasizing that this wasn't about punishment, but progress. "We can't move forward unless we're willing to listen to each other," he told them. And sometimes listening means sitting down and sharing stories. On a crisp Saturday morning, a small group of officers arrived at Elijah's house. They entered nervously, unsure of what to expect. Inside, Elijah had prepared tea and biscuits, setting out mismatched chairs in a circle in his modest living room. Photographs of his civil rights work adorned the walls, serving as silent witnesses to the history he embodied. As the officers settled in, their unease was palpable. No one spoke for several minutes. The air was thick with tension. Finally, Elijah broke the ice. "Let me tell you a little about myself," he said, leaning back in his chair. And so, he began to share his story, not just the highlights, but the raw, unfiltered details of his life. He spoke about growing up in the Jim Crow South, about the fear and resilience that defined his childhood. He recounted the marches, the protests, the nights spent in jail cells because he dared to demand equality. He described the joy of teaching students who went on to become leaders, doctors, lawyers, and activists themselves. And he talked about the pain of seeing racism persist, even decades after the civil rights movement. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The officers sat in stunned silence, grappling with the realization that they had wronged someone who had sacrificed so much for justice. Officer Ramirez, in particular, looked visibly shaken. "I never knew," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I never stopped to think about the people we're dealing with, their lives, their histories. I was just following orders, doing my job. But now I see how wrong that is." Elijah nodded, his expression compassionate but firm. "It's easy to dehumanize someone when you don't know their story," he said. "But once you do, it becomes harder to treat them unfairly. That's why conversations like this are so important. They remind us that we're all human beings deserving of respect and dignity." Encouraged by his openness, the officers began to open up as well. Some shared their own struggles, the pressures of working in law enforcement, the fear of making mistakes, the burden of wearing a uniform that often made them targets of mistrust. Others confessed their biases, acknowledging that they had judged Elijah based on stereotypes rather than facts. It was a vulnerable, uncomfortable conversation, but also a necessary one. Over the course of the afternoon, something remarkable happened. Walls came down. Misunderstandings were addressed. Empathy replaced judgment. By the time the officers left, they weren't just apologizing, they were committing to change. Several promised to advocate for reforms within the department, pushing for better training and greater accountability. Others vowed to approach their work with more compassion, recognizing that every person they encountered had a story worth hearing. For Elijah, the gathering was proof that redemption was possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. He knew that one conversation wouldn't solve centuries of inequality, but it was a step in the right direction, a seed planted in fertile soil, ready to grow into something bigger. In the weeks that followed, Elijah became a bridge between the community and law enforcement. He organized forums where residents could voice their concerns directly to officers. He facilitated workshops on cultural sensitivity and implicit bias, drawing on his experiences to foster understanding. And he continued to teach, not just history but lessons in humanity, urging everyone to see the world through each other's eyes. Though scars remained, both personal and societal, Elijah's courage inspired those around him to strive for a better future. His 5 simple words, "Do you know who I am?" had sparked a movement reminding everyone that identity mattered, that legacy mattered, and that justice required not just laws but hearts willing to listen and learn. And so, in the quiet town of Oak Ridge, a new chapter began, one rooted in hope, healing, and the enduring power of dialogue. The aftermath of the raid rippled through Oak Ridge like waves on a still pond, touching every corner of the community. What had started as an unjust and humiliating ordeal for Elijah Johnson became a catalyst for something far greater, a movement toward understanding, accountability, and healing. Though the scars of that morning would linger, both personally and collectively, the events that followed painted a picture of resilience and redemption. Elijah's invitation to the officers had been more than just an act of forgiveness. It was a bold step toward rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the people they served. Word of his efforts spread quickly, not only within Oak Ridge but across neighboring towns as well. Local newspapers wrote glowing articles about the elderly man who had turned a moment of injustice into a platform for change. Social media buzzed with posts praising his courage and calling for similar dialogues in other communities. Elijah, however, remained humble. "This isn't about me," he often said when asked about the attention. "It's about what we can achieve together." The forums and workshops he organized drew large crowds. Residents eager to share their concerns, officers willing to listen, and activists hoping to spark broader reforms. At one such gathering, held in the Oak Ridge Community Center, Elijah stood at the front of the room addressing a packed audience. His voice carried the same calm authority that had silenced the SWAT team weeks earlier. "We're here today because we believe in the possibility of change," he began. "But change doesn't happen overnight. It starts with honesty, with admitting where we've gone wrong and committing to do better." One by one, members of the community stepped forward to speak. A young mother recounted how her teenage son had been unfairly profiled during a routine traffic stop. An elderly veteran shared his frustration at being treated with suspicion simply because of his race. Even some officers spoke up, confessing their fears and frustrations while acknowledging the need for improvement. The room was filled with raw emotion: anger, sadness, hope, but above all, a shared desire to move forward. Among the attendees was Officer Ramirez, the young officer who had apologized to Elijah after the raid. He had taken Elijah's words to heart, becoming an advocate for reform within the police department. At the forum, he stood nervously before the crowd, holding a microphone in trembling hands. "I used to think my job was just about enforcing laws," he admitted, "but now I realize it's about serving people with respect, fairness, and compassion. Mr. Johnson taught me that, and I want to thank him, not just for forgiving us, but for showing us the way forward." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing off the walls of the community center. For many in the audience, it was a powerful reminder that individuals could make a difference, that even in moments of conflict, there was always room for growth and reconciliation. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of Elijah's work became undeniable. The police department implemented new training programs focused on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Officers were encouraged to engage with residents outside of tense situations, attending neighborhood barbecues, school events, and community cleanups. Slowly but surely, the mistrust that had once defined the relationship between law enforcement and Oak Ridge began to dissolve. Elijah himself became a fixture at these events, often seen chatting with officers or playing chess with children in the park. His presence alone seemed to ease tensions, reminding everyone of the progress they had made and the work that still lay ahead. Neighbors joked that he was the mayor of Oak Ridge, though Elijah laughed off the title. "I'm just a teacher," he'd say with a twinkle in his eye, "and if I've learned anything, it's that teaching never truly ends." Despite the positive changes, Elijah knew that systemic issues couldn't be solved overnight. Racism, prejudice, and inequality were deeply entrenched in society, requiring constant vigilance and effort to dismantle. But he also believed in the power of incremental progress. Every conversation, every workshop, every handshake brought them closer to a world where justice wasn't just a promise, it was a reality. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over Maple Street, Elijah sat on his porch sipping tea. Across the street, Mrs. Thompson waved to him before heading inside with her dog. Down the block, Tommy played basketball with a group of friends, laughing and shouting gleefully. The scene was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of that fateful morning months ago. As Elijah reflected on everything that had transpired, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for his own resilience, but for the support of his community and the willingness of others to listen and learn. He thought about the SWAT team, the neighbors, and even the skeptics who had doubted his intentions. Each interaction had been a thread in the tapestry of change, weaving together stories of struggle and triumph. His mind drifted back to those 5 simple words, "Do you know who I am?" They had frozen the SWAT team in their tracks, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths. But beyond that moment, they had sparked a chain reaction of reflection and action. Those words weren't just a question. They were a call to recognize the humanity in everyone, regardless of appearances or assumptions. In the end, Elijah's legacy wasn't defined by the injustices he had faced, but by the grace with which he responded to them. He had shown that true strength lies not in retaliation or bitterness, but in the ability to rise above hatred and inspire others to do the same. His life was a testament to the idea that one person, no matter how ordinary they might seem, could leave an extraordinary mark on the world. As night fell and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Elijah leaned back in his chair, feeling a profound sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But he was ready. After all, he had spent his entire life fighting for justice, and this chapter was no different. With each passing day, Oak Ridge grew stronger, more united, and more hopeful. And Elijah Johnson, the quiet hero of Maple Street, stood at the heart of it all, a living reminder that even in the darkest times, light could prevail.